There is a difference between embarrassment and shame. Embarrassment is the little brother to shame, the thing that is able to be laughed about later, that blows over as a funny part of being a human and generally can redirect us. Feeling stupid is nothing strange to me. I have had many embarrassing moments in my life. One sticks out that we laugh about in my family to date. It was a moment in my mid-20s. I was with my wife. We were on our honeymoon, driving in Europe to see my family in Italy, and I fell severely ill. I think I had something like 102 fever. So my wife had to drive courageously on the Italian highways. And at a rest stop, I stumbled in, half aware of my surroundings, and went to the bathroom where I encountered a few women who started yelling at me. Sure, I was in the wrong place, and I was sure I was in the right place, and I started yelling back, and then I went and used the urinal, and when I stumbled back out in my fever, I turned around and saw I had been in the women's room, and it wasn't a urinal. We laughed through my fever all the way to Assisi. Embarrassment. Shame is another thing. A soul-sucking, scarring, tearing thing. Not wrong bathrooms, but a sense that either you are wrong and judge yourself, or you are right and judged by others. It's looking down at your worn shoes that reveal your true middle classness while trying to pass for something you aren't. It's hiding the wrinkles natural to your age that you feel somehow judge you. It is something you are protecting yourself from. It is something that thrusts you into a frame of soul that tells you you are bad or wrong. It is something done to you or done to yourself that makes you feel out of place, as if your soul is breaking. I've heard your shame stories. They are mostly come in the form of questions. Can I be here if my husband divorced me and left me for a younger woman? Can I have AIDS here? Can I sit in the pews and go to AA? Are working class people welcome here in this fancy neighborhood church? Each of these things is real, has happened, and the tie that binds them is not embarrassment, but shame. I was on a call this week where we were helping think about how to help congregations like ours get the reproductive freedom designation that we have for our work on sex-positive faith and restoration, work that we've done since the 70s. And a UCC colleague told a story on that call that when she was a young girl in church, in her church, not a Unitarian church, not a UCC church, the pastor one day called up a 19-year-old young woman to the front and told the whole congregation that this young woman was pregnant, that she was not married, that she was a shame to herself and to the church. And then he called up the young man, her boyfriend, and briefly admonished him, but made him sit down while the girl remained at the front. The church focused their shame on this girl. To what end? What kind of Christianity is that, I asked. Is that what the church is for? Because we are all taught that certain feelings, certain loves, certain identities are shameful, banished, divisive, and dangerous. We all absorb these messages every day. We participate them, we prop them up. It is a soul-rending culture that prevails in the world of shame. I met a man once in India who told me a story that while he was younger, we were sitting in a coffee shop. He was an older man. He was gentle, a big smile. He seemed to have a torn soul. He told me that for years he had swept the streets. In India, a person who sweeps up garbage in the streets is seen as others as no more than garbage himself. The street sweepers are the lowest caste, the untouchables, named because if you touch an untouchable as a Hindu of a higher caste, you have to ritually bathe and pray to God. Imagine the inherent shame in that system. So you can imagine the untouchables live in slums together and do menial jobs. The objects of scorn, they are held in an economic situation that keeps them in poverty. The man had 3 daughters because some days he worked in the sewers and was verbally and physically abused. He hid who he was from his family. He would bathe in a public bath before going home. He never told his daughters what he did. When they asked, he said, "I am a laborer." He said he worked on construction sites, a more honorable profession. But in his heart, he was ashamed of who he was. So he decided to save every penny he made for his daughter's education. He never bought new clothes. He lived as simple as he could so he could buy his daughters books and schooling, so that maybe one day they could get out of that cycle of poverty that he was in. When the day came when his first daughter was accepted into college, he realized he didn't have enough for the admissions fees. So he sat down in his workplace in tears the whole day. His life had added up to nothing. He realized at that moment that he couldn't go home and face his family anymore. For what other cultural or violent or soul-crushing narratives we tell ourselves or are told or thrust into, we consider ourselves from time to time dangerous and guilty and tarnished and less than. We participate in an exhausting and soul-gashing, life-altering experience called shame. Whether we do this to ourselves or it is done to us, that shame weighs us down, rends our hearts, and the church has not helped. In fact, any follower of the God of love, Jesus, the compassion of hope, knows that more shame and banishment is not the core of our faith. In Christianity, it is right there in the last statement on judgment, right before Jesus is arrested. Behold, God will come. He will put the sheep at his right hand and goats to the left. I've always bristled at this idea of goats and sheep because so often it is invoked that the sheep are the believers and the goats are the non-believers, right? But listen more carefully this time. Then the king will say to those at the right hand, the sheep, those who are being blessed, "Come, you are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me in," etc., etc. And they argued. They said, "Truly, I tell you," they said, "we didn't do any of those things, but to you." Then the king answers, "Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." The text does not say that you believed the right things, you prayed the right prayers, you attended enough worships in church, you said the right things, you created some categories of who was right and who was wrong based on your thoughts about someone who loved you and who was loved, what they looked like, what they could do. It says you are sheep because despite of all the things that you believed, you fed and you gave water and you housed and you clothed and you blessed at least one person in your life. so you did the holy work of blessing. You lifted someone out of shame. You did not put them into shame. Another interpretation, you did not sit on your high horse, shaming people based on categories you thought God judged to be better or to be worse in human life. Condemning some because they didn't fit your image of what the right kind of person is. You're blessed because you love them into being. You saw them as full members of the human family, everyone, not some, but all. You went against the culture of shame and you blessed someone. You cherished them. You were the expression of care and God's love that goes beyond boundary. That is what the sheep are. Not true believers in some idea, but true actors on the compassion, love of God. When you did that, you were part of the act of mending the soul. So let's return to the man in the coffee shop in India. That day at the end of work, all his co-workers came to him and asked him as he sat in a heap of pain and failure. They asked, "You consider us brothers and sisters, right?" And he said he did. And they surrounded him, and one by one they gave him their day's wages. And when they had all piled their few rupees on this man, the last one said, "We would rather starve a day than see our daughter not go to college." That day the man did not bathe until he got home. He went into the house, told his daughters about the life that he led, that they knew nothing about, told them who he was and what had happened that day. And they counted out the money, and it was enough for the entry fees for the oldest daughter. Years later, all three of his girls were educated and working in good jobs, and they took care of their father. They wouldn't let him sweep the streets anymore, but once a month they all cooked food enough for all his co-workers. And when the workers asked them why they were being fed, the girls said, "Because you were willing to go hungry one day for us so that we could become who we are. And beyond that, you lifted our father from shame to blessed." And each time they asked the co-workers to pray for them, they told them as long as they could, they would help each have food and enough for their children's educations. The man in the coffee shop grinned at me and asked, "True story?" It didn't matter. The message was received. We have to do the work that mends the soul of each of us, that combats shame of any kind. We have to lift each other up to do the real work of the God of love. I imagine an ending to my colleague's painful story about the pregnant girl in her church. And since it's Oscars night, and I've been thinking a lot about those movies, I will use some Tarantino-esque story rewriting without all the violence. To imagine that young 19-year-old girl left the church that day that had shamed her in front of everyone, and never, ever returned. She either had that baby or she didn't by choice. She grew up with or without that boyfriend. But after years of cursing the church, and for good reason, for putting her on display for being a human being who had urges of love, was invited to our church, where she came in and heard a sermon about a young woman who was shamed in front of her church, and heard the preacher's stories and voice, how painful he knew it was for people to be shamed by their faith. And she sat in the back pew and she wept. and she wept out all the poison that her church put in her. And from that moment on, her soul started to mend by the love of the people of that church. A church that doesn't only profess to be the church of the God of love, but lives it out. Here we love you into being, no matter what your work is, what flaws you have or sins you have committed, or what circumstances your life is in. This is a place that feeds and clothes and loves you when you most need it. The mending of the soul is hard work, and it happens not in lonely responses to life, but in community. Community that knows the spiritual price of this work. So the next time you feel like hiding because of who you are or what is happening in your life, come out here in church. Next time you feel vulnerable, that shame is creeping into the crevices of your soul, come in here. There are people who are trained in how to receive your pain. And there are people around that love you into being. The next time you feel so vulnerable that shame is creeping in, come in here and weep out the poisons and the hurt. The next time you feel like you failed or you wonder if you belong or your soul needs a little mending, come here and receive the blessings of songs that are from the past remembered, the light that holds us, the love that is greater than all of us put together. Come in here to church that professes and practices to be the church of the God of love, and know it is real. I love you. We love you. Amen.